Story 1. I never think of Missouri. I am not trying to be rude. It is just the truth. Story 2. I'll be deep in the cold ground before I recognize Missouri. Ab Simpson. Story 3. St. Louis barbecue, Kansas City jazz, and 18th and Vine. There are high homicide rates and a lot of Trump support once you are about 10 minutes outside St. Louis or Kansas City, or in college towns like Columbia and Rolla. Missouri did get the better pick of the terrain because once you cross into Kansas it is quite boring. The Ozarks are awesome. St. Louis was home to the World's Fair in 1904. St. Louis has a free zoo. Mark Twain. Story 4. Josh Hawley rushing to get away from the January 6 participants who were energized by his rhetoric. Story 5. Missouri shares its border with more states than any other state because it loves company. Story 6. Reliably red state with 3 bright blue dots, representing the state's 2 largest metropolitan areas and its largest university city. Republicans in the state have no interest in bipartisanship and discard the results of referendums when they do not like the outcome. Story 7. Independence, Missouri, the place where I began my trek on the Oregon Trail. I had difficulty hunting and fording rivers, and I often died of dysentery. Story 8. My son just came home with a map of the United States, and he had to color the states he wanted to visit. He colored New York, California, Hawaii, and Missouri. I asked why Missouri, and he said, because that's where Star-Lord is from. Story 9. Missouri is an interesting state in the Midwest with Eastern and Southern influences. People who meet for the first time in St. Louis will ask where you went to high school. A newspaper writer once said that St. Louis is the only city that built a monument to those who left. The Arch. I no longer live there, and there are things I miss, but the state has really changed in recent years. Parts of Missouri are very scenic. Rivers, rolling hills, tall trees, and lots of history. Story 10. I went to the top of the St. Louis Arch and freaked out quite a bit. I went straight across and immediately got back on the terrifying elevator. The city museum is great, though. Story 11. I don't think of Missouri, but if I did it would be the Ozarks, the Missouri River, and the absolute idiots in the Republican Party running the state. Story 12. That ranch kid from the Fairly OddParents cartoon, the one who lived inside a novel. Story 13. We have something in this area called the Missouri Boat Ride. Story 14. Charlene Frazier, a fictional character from Designing Women, hails from Poplar Bluff. Story 15. Kansas City Royals and Kansas City Chiefs, St. Louis Cardinals, University of Missouri and Missouri State University, and the evacuation of Times Beach. Story 16. Ted Drew's frozen custard. I grew up mostly in Omaha. Kansas City was the nearest large city and the destination of several fun road trips in high school. I went to college in St. Louis, and it felt very urban compared with Omaha. It is strange that Omaha is so much larger than it was when I was a child, while the city of St. Louis has shrunk. Story 17. I think of toasted ravioli, St. Louis-style pizza, and East St. Louis-style fried rice. Story 18. I will be deep in the cold ground before I recognize Missouri. Story 19. My main memory is going camping in Missouri and getting a tick on my scrotum. Story 20. I rarely think of Missouri, but when I do I think of Arthur Bryant's barbecue, crime, and the scene from National Lampoon where they stop in East St. Louis. Yes, technically that is in Illinois. If you do not live in the region, it is largely outside your consciousness, similar to Nebraska, North Dakota, and Iowa. Story 21. My Aunt Donna Werslin was my favorite among many. She was such a lady. Story 22. Japan formally surrendered at the end of World War II on September 2, 1945. Story 23. Born and raised in Missouri. I've traveled across the United States and to more than 30 countries. I kind of enjoy the low-key, easy life of the show-me state. I'm sitting on my front porch, smoking and listening to the peeper frogs right now. Could be worse. Story 24. Bart Simpson said that Branson, Missouri, is like Las Vegas if it were run by Ned Flanders. Story 25. Birthplace of Carl Stalling, the legendary cartoon music composer. Story 26. Grandpa Simpson does not recognize it as a state in The Simpsons. Story 27. I went to middle school with a very strange girl whose name I don't remember. Looking back, it's clear she was abused or neglected, but to my 12-year-old self she was just strange. She got pregnant in high school and named the baby Misery, a name combining misery and Missouri. It's been 20 years, and I still think of that child at least once a month. Story 28. My wife, whom I love deeply. Then puppy mills and methamphetamine. Story 29. My dad lives there now. We don't talk anymore. He doesn't realize it's because of his Make America Great Again politics. He's been indoctrinated into a cult. I don't have the energy to help him. Story 30. I live here. The first thing that comes to mind when I think of Missouri is that it is full of racist, homophobic rednecks, but not in St. Louis, Kansas City, or Columbia. Story 31. 2 YouTube channels I enjoy. Project Farm and Aging Wheels. It was legal to kill adherents of one particular religion for well over a century, 1838 to 1976. It was unconstitutional, and it was enforced only when it was new. Story 32. Nothing. Wait, I think I have something, the Show Me State. Story 33. Randy Orton is from St. Louis. That's legitimately all I know. Story 34. El Jimador. Damn good fajitas when you are lost in the woods. Story 35. I have a friend from Vietnam who pronounces it as misery. It's especially cute when she says, I used to live in misery. Story 36. Truck stops, furniture warehouses, and the bloody border war. Story 37. I had a shitty business partner there. He was totally incompetent and, as I later found out, also dishonest. Story 38. How they fumbled justice for Dee Dee Blanchard by allowing her daughter to receive a lenient plea of 8.5 years for the brutal murder without gathering all the facts. Story 39. Many years ago, I visited a friend who lived in Clinton. For some reason, the place gave me the willies. Story 40. That scene when Kathy Bates hobbles him, the sounds were visceral. I cringed just remembering it. Story 41. I have called it misery since living there for a year in my early 20s. Story 42. I don't have a Starbucks cup from there. I collect the Been There series. Story 43. All I'm going to say is that some of the most thick-headed people I have ever met were from Missouri. Story 44. There were tornado warnings. On my first night, I was woken by the alarm at 2 o'clock in the morning. It was the worst way to wake up. Story 45. Mormons believe that this was the location of the original Garden of Eden. Source. I was raised Mormon. Story 46. Yes, that is where my tattoo artist moved. Now I have to find someone new. Story 47. My husband is from there, so I think of him. The National World War I Museum and Memorial is in Kansas City, and it is my favorite museum. I also think of Great Barbecue. Story 48. A boy in my 6th grade class loved to talk about Missouri because he was from there. He talked about it as if it were the Wild West and spoke in an exaggerated accent for about a minute before moving on. We learned later in high school that he had only been born there and that his family had moved to Illinois. Story 49. I was driving to a family friend's house outside Kansas City. We stopped at a rest stop just inside the Missouri state border. We got out and a child complained about the heat. Then he said to his grandmother, "Do you know why they call it Missouri? Because it sounds like misery." Story 50. I was forced to visit my grandparents who lived there and clearly did not like children. But seriously, I would say the St. Louis Arch is the main thing that comes to mind. Story 51. Good fishing. I have been there several times to fish and have never been disappointed. Story 52. One of my grandfathers was from Missouri and somehow ended up in Seattle, where I was born and raised. He pronounced onions as injurns. Story 53. The German festival in Hermann, Missouri, and the family friend who introduced me to it. Story 54. I just rewatched Deadwood. George Hurst and Calamity Jane are from Missouri. Story 55. Some kind of compromise. If only I could remember what it was called. Story 56. The governor is terrible, I hear. Alyssa Bustamante was a teenager and a killer. I was following that case at the time. Story 57. Everyone I know regularly drives down for fireworks and now for marijuana. I am from Iowa. Story 58. The quilting town mother became bored much more quickly than she had expected. Story 59. The Show Me State. I only know it from a Clint Eastwood movie. Story 60. A complete blank. I have never been there and cannot remember anything about it. Is it even real? Story 61. Missouri. I learned to spell all the states in 3rd grade. Story 62. The stainless steel arch in St. Louis is something I always wanted to see in person, but I probably never will at this point in my life. Story 63. I think of the time I floated down a river in Missouri, and there were intoxicated adults happily throwing rocks at each other. Story 64. I forgot whether it was them or Mississippi, but one of them did not ratify the 13th Amendment until the 1990s, I think. Story 65. Well, last week it was St. Louis. Now it's the Cobra outbreak of 1953. Story 66. I saw the arch while traveling to and from Arkansas. It's pretty dope. Story 67. My Mormon family, who have all moved away, now live in the land where the second coming of Jesus is expected to occur. Story 68. Branson is a place where we sell many vacation timeshares. I do not know why. Older adults think it is like Hawaii without the ocean. Story 69. There are probably many people there with summer teeth. Summer is everywhere. Story 70. It is one of 8 states starting with the letter M and is pronounced really stupidly. Story 71. 2000 to 2011 St. Louis Cardinals. We went all the time, and they were stacked and exciting year after year. Ownership has destroyed that franchise and we stopped going. Story 72. There is constant road work. Do you all have an excess of traffic cones and do not know what to do with them? The last time I drove through Missouri, there were so many cones everywhere with no construction happening. Story 73. They elected a Drug Enforcement Administration agent instead of John Ashcroft, and then President Bush made him Attorney General. That was the best decision Missouri ever made. Story 74. Clark. You see that, kids? That is the St. Louis Arch, the gateway to the west. It is over 600 feet tall, and there is an elevator all the way to the top. That is 60 stories to you and me. Kids. Wow, Dad. Can we go up on it? Clark. No. Story 75. If I hear the word spoken, I play it back in a weird southern accent where the word does not end with an E sound at all. Sounds more like Missouri. Story 76. That scene from American Dad when Stan disappears, everyone goes crazy, and Francine keeps saying Missouri. Story 77. I try not to, but if I do it is usually because I remember something about my ex or someone mentions the Royals or the Chiefs. That reminds me how much I do not like him and makes me dislike much of what is related to the state. Story 78. This is a shithole, literally my least favorite state in the nation. Story 79. I asked my students, who are college students in Florida, this a while ago. The Arch, Patrick Mahomes, and the Kansas City Chiefs. Story 80. My child is at the University of Missouri, so I have a more positive association with the state because they love it there. Story 81. I don't know where Missouri is. I hope they have grand psychedelics to overcome boredom in that remote state. I think I may have picked up the best barbecue there on a road trip once. Story 82. Paw prints painted on the road. Drive through once and that is still it. Near the university. Story 83. An alligator lies in a hammock, plays the banjo by the Missouri River, and tells stories in a thick southern accent. Story 84. Choosing who runs your state can determine whether you earn a good wage or a poor one. Right now, it is not much different from the South, Indiana, and soon Ohio. Some common attitudes there include the beliefs that $7.25 per hour is too much, that unions are communists, and that healthcare is a privilege rather than a right. The people I have met from there are friendly. Story 85. Ignorance and, frankly, the fact that it is not Mississippi. Story 86. The one time I drove through, I thought, how much longer am I going to be stuck here? Story 87. I visited St. Louis once, but if the state is mentioned, I think of Colonel Potter from the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. Story 88. In 5th grade, we had to prepare a report on one of the states of the United States. I was assigned Missouri. Story 89. People talk about Texas barbecue, but you have not truly experienced it until you have tasted Kansas City barbecue. Story 90. I do not recall thinking of Missouri, but if I hear the name, I think of Branson. Story 91. I went to Missouri once, and a 6-year-old smoking a Marlboro Red told me to go fuck myself. Story 92. Once I hitchhiked through southern Missouri and accidentally camped behind a truck stop frequented by gay men. The next morning, while packing up, I found a used syringe under my tent as I rolled it up. Missouri lives up to that stereotype. Story 93. I've lived within 30 miles of Missouri for too many years. Low education, religious nut jobs, and infinite defensiveness. Run away unless you are in a wealthy suburb. I'm not classist, but truly the interior of the state makes you hear banjos. Story 94. When I was 11, my family and grandparents took a road trip to Branson. I did not care much for the town, but I was very interested in the Mark Twain sites and museums we visited along the way. Story 95. Rain for some reason. To be honest, I know jack fuck about Missouri, except it's also called misery. Story 96. Fudge and fireworks. While driving through the state, I saw that half the billboards advertised them. Story 97. The puppy mill capital of the world. The auctions are truly horrific to behold. I was active in pug rescue for years. Story 98. That episode of The Fairly OddParents where Tom Sawyer shouts, "No, I don't want to go back to Missouri." Story 99. An overtly racist place that I still have to visit once a year. Story 100. Memories from 40 years ago, not in any particular order. The Ozarks. The first time I tried biscuits and mushroom gravy. I saw a cross burning in the woods. Many missile silos. Metal grate bridges. Beer with 3% alcohol sold on Sundays. An above-ground pool. Paper checks at every store where you could fill your account numbers. Velveeta. Stone quarries. Watching a friend from Florida in awe during his first snowfall. Story 101. I thought, damn, I am not even halfway there, because the only times I have been in Missouri were when I was driving from Ohio to Texas or California. Story 102. I grew up there. It is a beautiful state, especially the Ozarks. There are many wonderful springs, rivers, and forests. Two great cities are Kansas City and St. Louis. It has stupendous museums, music, barbecue, Forest Park, and the St. Louis Zoo. There is the World War I Museum. Hiking, hunting, and fishing are excellent. Go there. Story 103. I'm not from Earth. I'm from Missouri. That's on Earth, dipshit. Story 104. Truck drivers on methamphetamine and strip club billboards. Sorry, I have only driven through. Story 105. The Arch is nice, and once you get out of the greater St. Louis area, it is pleasant. Story 106. A state filled with people who consistently vote against their own interests. Story 107. Politics aside, I live about 3 hours east of St. Louis in Indiana. I grew up a Cardinals fan and have always enjoyed my trips to Six Flags, the zoo, the Gateway Arch, baseball games, and good food. Story 108. As an Iowan, I remember my aunt and uncle's farm and tractor rides as a child. As an adult, I enjoyed Kansas City speakeasies and the Hotel Phillips. Don't forget the northernmost Waffle House I know of. Story 109. I think, is Missouri the one called the Show Me State? I wonder what that means, but I am not curious enough to Google it. Story 110. We traveled across a few states to see the eclipse in St. Joseph. It was rainy, but we still saw it. Story 111. I think about being there 2 months ago to see my niece graduate from National Guard training. Story 112. My immediate reaction. The only thing I know about Missouri is that Grandpa Simpson hates that state. Story 113. Once I was reading an article that mentioned Missouri, and I thought it was the name of a Japanese designer. Story 114. Anheuser-Busch, St. Louis, Missouri, Branson, the St. Louis Arch. Meet me in St. Louis, Kansas City. Story 115. I live there. I cannot weigh in on the good or bad as much as others in this thread because I do not get out much and have not seen much of it. The Arch is pretty cool and St. Louis has a nice zoo. There is a dinosaur museum in Branson that was awesome. Instead of fossils or skeletons, they made life-sized models of how the animals would have looked alive, so walking in feels like prehistoric taxidermy. The figures were posed to appear to stare at eye level, which was unsettling. The T-Rex was especially mind-blowing. It was almost as long as the building was wide, and they placed smaller dinosaurs under it. The staff said they would get a Quetzalcoatl soon, so I hope to return to see it. Story 116. Hilariously bad Christian billboards. Uranus Fudge Factory. Story 117. I visited there as a child in the 1970s. I went to the top of the St. Louis Arch, petted the Clydesdales at the Budweiser Brewery, watched the Cardinals play baseball, and went to the zoo. Story 118. Amish Puppy Mill Hill. I am currently caring for a poodle who was tortured in a shed in Missouri for 8 years. He has no teeth left and has suffered severe trauma. He is strong and clearly a survivor. Fuck Missouri. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.